Welcome back to the Unfiltered Political Lens. We are going to dive right into part 2, the Franklin Scandal, Power, Silence, and the Search for Truth. When a criminal investigation officially ends, most stories gradually fade into history. Court records are archived, newspaper headlines disappear, and public attention shifts toward new events. The Franklin scandal followed a very different path because despite the official findings, the debate never truly stopped. Instead, the case entered a second life driven by independent researchers, investigative journalists, former law enforcement officials, authors, filmmakers, internet communities, and survivors of unrelated abuse cases who viewed Franklin through an entirely different lens. One reason the controversy endured and the official conclusions had satisfied some observers while leaving others deeply unconvinced. The Nebraska Grand Jury concluded that the broader abuse allegations were an elaborate hoax and found insufficient credibility evidence to support criminal indictments based on those claims. To many people, those findings represented the legal resolution of the matter. Others argued that a grand jury's decision not to indict is not necessarily proof that the alleged events never occurred, only that the investigators did not believe the available evidence met the legal standard required to proceed. The distinction is important because the criminal investigations had operated under the strict evidentiary rules. The prosecutors generally must believe they can prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt before bringing charges. However, the allegations alone, even if sincerely believed by those making them, they were not enough, and supporters of the Franklin allegations had argued that this legal threshold is especially difficult to meet. In cases involving historical abuse, particularly when physical evidence has disappeared, memories have faded, and many alleged events occurred years before investigators became involved. The critics responded that these same challenges make rigorous evidence even more essential. They point out that serious criminal accusations can permanently damage the reputations and therefore require reliable corroboration beyond testimony that contains inconsistencies. The official investigations repeatedly emphasized that this concern throughout the Franklin investigation. They argued that extraordinary claims demanded exceptionally strong evidence, and they concluded that such evidence was not present. The debate over witness credibility remains one of the most difficult aspects of the case. Modern psychological research had recognized that trauma can affect the memory in complicated ways. Survivors of abuse sometimes remember the events in fragmented or nonlinear patterns, and details may change over time without necessarily providing intentional deception. But at the same time, psychologists also recognize that the memory is not a perfect recording device, and it can be influenced by suggestion, repeated questioning, stress, or even the passage of time. Because of this, evaluating testimony requires balancing compassion with evidentiary discipline. The supporters argue that inconsistency should not automatically invalidate abuse allegations. The skeptics counter that significant contradiction, which become increasingly important when the testimony forms a primary basis for the allegations lacking independent physical evidence. Both perspectives had reflected real challenges that investigators continue to face in abuse cases today. As the public discussion expanded beyond Nebraska, Franklin became intertwined with broader concerns about the institutional accountability. During the 90s and 2000s, revelations emerged involving the abuse within churches, schools, youth organizations, athletic programs, and other trusted institutions. Now, many of those scandals demonstrated that the credible allegations had sometimes been ignored for years before eventually being substantiated. For some researchers, these later cases had suggested that Franklin deserved renewed attention because the history had shown that powerful institutions are very capable of failing vulnerable victims. Others had cautioned against drawing direct parallels. Every investigation involves different evidence, different witnesses, different suspects, and different legal standards. The fact that the institutional failures occurred elsewhere does not establish that every disputed allegation in another case is true. Responsible historical analysis requires evaluating each case on its own merits, rather than assuming that one scandal proves another. Perhaps no later comparison has been made more frequently than that involving Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein's eventual conviction and the extensive investigation into his network had demonstrated that the wealthy and politically connected individuals could exploit vulnerable young people while maintaining relationships with influential figures across business, politics, and entertainment. The supporters of the renewed interest in Franklin argued that the Epstein case made allegations once dismissed as implausible appear more conceivable in hindsight. The critics respond that while Epstein's crimes are well documented, they cannot be used as evidence that separate the allegations from decades earlier are necessarily accurate. Now, the comparison nevertheless changed public perception, and before Epstein's arrest, discussions of organized abuse involving influential individuals were often dismissed by many observers as inherently unbelievable. But after extensive federal investigations, civil litigation, and documentary evidence had emerged in the Epstein case, public attitudes shifted considerably. The existence of one documented criminal network, however, does not determine the truth or falsity of unrelated allegations elsewhere. Another recurring topic involves claims that evidence disappeared during the Franklin investigation. Supporters have long argued that missing records, alleged photographs, or other materials prevented investigators from fully establishing what had occurred. They point particularly to reports surrounding the Gary Cardori's final investigation and the claims that some materials he allegedly possessed were never recovered after the plane crash. The official investigations did not conclude the missing evidence demonstrated criminal interference, and no definitive public record has established that such materials contain proof of the broader allegations. Questions have also persisted, however, regarding the law enforcement coordination. Some of the critics argue that the agencies failed to fully cooperate, prematurely dismissed certain leads. Others believe the investigators thoroughly examined available information and sharply found insufficient collaboration to support those prosecutions. Because many investigative files remain incomplete or were never made public in full disagreements, which will continue regarding whether every potential lead received adequate attention. The Franklin controversy has also become a case study in how narratives evolve over time. Books, documentaries, interviews, podcasts, online forums, and social media discussions have also introduced new audiences to the allegations decades after the original investigation concluded. With each retelling, emphasis sometimes shifts towards different pieces of evidence, different witnesses, or different interpretations of existing records. Now, this process can both preserve the historical interest and complicate the efforts to distinguish documented fact from later speculation. And researchers approaching Franklin often divide the available information into several categories. First are the established facts, including the financial fraud, Lawrence King's conviction on financial charges, and the grand jury proceedings. The perjury convictions and Gary Cardori's fatal plane crash with its official determination of accidental structural failure. Second are the documented allegations made by the witnesses that appear in transcripts, interviews, and investigative records. Third are the interpretations and theories advanced by later authors, some of which extended well beyond what official investigations concluded. Maintaining these distinctions is very essential because the categories are, frequently blurred in the public's discussions. An allegation recorded in court documents is historically significant because it was made, but that does not automatically establish that the allegation is true. Likewise, an official finding rejecting an allegation reflects the investigator's conclusions based on available evidence, but it does not necessarily answer every historical question beyond all doubt. The difference between documented claims and proven facts lies in the heart of responsible historical analysis. The Franklin scandal also raises a broader question about the investigative institutions themselves. How should governments respond when allegations involve individuals who allegedly possess political influence or social status? How can investigators reassure the public that inquiries remain impartial regardless of who may be implicated? Conversely, how can the legal system protect innocent individuals from false accusations while still encouraging the genuine victims to come forward? These questions extend far beyond Franklin, and they remain relevant today. The public's trust plays an enormous role in how people interpret unresolved cases. Individuals who possess strong confidence in investigative institutions will often accept the official conclusions unless compelling contradictory evidence emerges. Others who believe the institutions have repeatedly concealed the misconduct may view the same conclusions with a greater skepticism. These differing assumptions frequently influence the interpretations of Franklin as much as the underlying evidence itself. Historical examples exist supporting this caution on both sides. Governments have sometimes concluded misconduct, withheld information, or made serious investigative mistakes. At other times, highly publicized allegations have ultimately proven false, despite the widespread public belief. Recognizing both realities helps explain why the Franklin case continues to divide observers decades later. Another reason Franklin remains controversial is the emotional weight carried by the allegations. Involving children, crimes against children naturally provoke the intense public reactions because they violate the fundamental morale and expectations. This emotional impact can sometimes make objective evaluation more difficult and increasing pressure either to believe every allegation immediately or to dismiss the controversial claims entirely. Responsible investigations is required to avoid both extremes. Now, the case has also influenced the discussions about the investigative journalism. Gary Cardori's work is frequently cited as an example of the risk journalists and investigators may face when examining politically sensitive subjects. The supporters view him as someone who died while pursuing important truths. Though official investigators found no evidence that his fatal crash resulted from foul play. Regardless of one's interpretation, his role remains one of the most enduring and debated elements of the Franklin narrative. For historians, Franklin demonstrated how unresolved controversies become part of public memory. And once competing narratives become established, they often persist even as the information emerges. The supporters of different interpretations may emphasize different documents, witness statements, or investigative findings, while assigning different levels of credibility to each source. Over time, the debate itself becomes part of the historical record. The modern digital archives have made many original documents more accessible than they have ever during the early 90s. Court records, newspapers, article interviews, legislative materials, and books can now be examined by researchers across the world. This increased accessibility has encouraged renewed scholarly and public interest, yet wider access has not produced universal agreement, illustrating that access to the same documents does not always lead to identical conclusions. One of the most valuable lessons from the Franklin narrative concerns the importance of evidence-based thinking. A genuine skepticism should neither reject allegations simply because they appear disturbing, nor accept them merely because they involve powerful individuals. Instead, responsible inquiry requires carefully examining the available evidence, recognizing the uncertainty where it exists, and remaining willing to revise conclusions. If credible new information emerges, this approach protects both potential victims seeking justice and individuals entitled to the presumption of innocence. As decades have passed, many of the principal figures connected to the original investigation have died or grown elderly. Lawrence E. King Jr. died in 2002 after serving his sentence for financial crimes. Gary Cardori's investigation had ended with his tragic death in the 1990s. Other investigator witnesses, journalists, attorneys, and public officials have left behind interviews, testimony, and records that continue to shape historical understanding. Their accounts remain available for examination, but the opportunities for new first-hand testimony naturally diminish with time. Today, the Franklin scandal has occupied a unique place in American history. It is simultaneously a documented financial fraud, a contested criminal investigation, a subject of books and documentaries, a case study in institutional trust, and an enduring source of public debate. Official investigations had concluded that the broader abuse allegations were unsubstantiated and characterized them as fabricated, while supporters continue to argue that the significant questions remain unanswered, and that some witnesses were never fully heard. Those two realities have coexisted for more than 3 decades without being fully reconciled. Ultimately, the Franklin scandal reminds us that history is not always a collection of neatly resolved stories. Sometimes it is a record of competing narratives, incomplete evidence, legal conclusions, personal testimony, institutional decisions, and unanswered questions that continue to challenge researchers long after the courtrooms have closed. The duty of historians, journalists, and citizens is not to replace evidence with certainty where certainty does not exist, but to distinguish documented fact from allegation, acknowledging the conclusions that are reached by the official investigations, recognizing the limitations of the available evidence, and remaining responsible, examine the controversial chapters like the Franklin scandal, while honoring both the pursuit of truth and the principles of justice upon which a free society depends. I want to thank you once again for tuning in to the Unfiltered Political Lens. I want to thank you for being here with us today. And as always, we'll see you in the next one. Peace.